The first part really makes no sense without the second part, but the second part makes no sense without the first part. So you really need the two. Last time we were talking quite a bit about inequality and the fact that, of course, some people are benefiting more than others. It's been quite clear, and I think this is what all of us know, that especially minorities, and in this country that includes foremost African Americans, but also immigrants. Sometimes we talk about Black and brown people, women, and so on, have not been benefiting from this situation as much as everybody else. But then again, not everybody, even sort of in the white majority, has been benefiting equally. And that's one of the crucial points we have to keep in mind: who ultimately is benefiting and who isn't. And what does that mean for resolving the problems? Let me start us off with a quick quote from Frederick Douglass, who you all know, important African-American leader from the past, who not only had some observations about the problem, but also some solutions. Let me give you the quote from Douglass, and then we're going into a reflection on Matthew 18, verses 23 to 35. We talked about this last time, this parable of the unforgiving servant. So here's the quote from Frederick Douglass. Actually, I can give you, let me see if I can share my screen. You have to make me a co-host, Carlene. I guess I cannot share the screen.
And then you're able to do that.
Okay, I can do that. Then I can show you the slide with, there we go. It may take just a minute. You can see the Douglass quote. There we go. This is some of our slides from last time. We talked about inequality. And here is the Frederick Douglass quote. The slave is robbed by his master of all his earnings above what is required for his physical necessities. And the white man is robbed by the slave system because he is flung into competition with a class of laborers who work without wages. What Douglass is talking about is the slave system that we're all aware of, where people become the physical property of others, where what is robbed, of course, is the earnings, as Douglass is saying, but a lot more than just earnings. What's robbed also is relationships, people's lives, people's communities, and so on. But what Douglass is saying is that this stealing of wages, of the earnings of the slaves, actually affects not only the slaves, but others as well. And if you look at the history of the time, it was quite clear that workers in the South were also affected by slavery. So the fact that slaves basically were forced to work for free also meant that the masters and the system could keep wages down of white workers in the South. And what's actually interesting is that white workers in the South not only earned less than white workers in the North, they even earned less than Black workers in the North. And so slavery here, what Douglass is saying, is pernicious because it affects us all in a way that ultimately affects everything. So when you take that into account, the question of solidarity emerges. This is something I also want to talk about today. Do we think of ourselves as simply the people that come in from the outside trying to remedy a situation that doesn't affect us? Or do we have to take into account that we live in a world that actually hurts many more of us, oftentimes without us even being aware of it? In the Christian tradition, of course, we oftentimes think that we solve the problems of the world through charity. And oftentimes the assumption is that charity is perhaps the most Christian response to the suffering of the world, right? Last time we talked about Jesus telling John, the poor will have good news brought to them. But charity may not be the way to actually bring good news to the poor that says you will no longer be poor. It's simply filling the gap, right? So far, I think we're on the same page. Now, for more open Christians, and I think we're part of that group, we oftentimes think about advocacy. And advocacy means not only helping the poor, but speaking out against poverty, speaking out against racism, speaking out against sexism, and so on. But the limits of advocacy are that we oftentimes think we're the ones who are controlling the system. We're the ones who are actually able and have the power to change everything, while in reality, the system is a lot bigger than us. And in order to change anything, I want to argue today, we really need to understand how we're in this together. This is Paul's famous comment in 1 Corinthians 12, right? If one member suffers, all suffer together with it. So the system, as Frederick Douglass points out, actually hurts us all in some ways. Of course, some get hurt worse than others. This is not in doubt. This is clear. In the case of slavery, the slaves get hurt much worse than everybody else. But the problem is that white people, and this is the problem of white supremacy, are led to believe that they are all benefiting from the system equally, while in truth, who is benefiting is not everybody, but the white people at the top. It is the owners of the slaves. It is the owners of the plantations. It is those in the corporations who are actually able now to put others to work, and oftentimes put others to work for less. That's where we have to begin again. And this is the context in which I want us to take another look at this parable of the unforgiving servant. Since time is short, I'm hoping you had a chance to read it over the week. We announced it last week. But you know the story, right? So let's not read it right now. But the story basically goes, there's a master who forgives one of his servants an enormous amount of debt. And as he does that, the servant then goes out, finds a fellow servant in the street. And of course, if we talk about servant, the original language really is slave, right? Finds a fellow slave in the street who asks that slave to forgive. He doesn't. He has that slave thrown into prison. And then the other slaves come together and say, well, there's something wrong with it. They go back to the master and say, this is not right. That's the story. And the way we tell that is oftentimes in a moralizing way, right? Saying that if you have been forgiven, you should now also forgive. Now, the truth is, this doesn't happen a whole lot, right? This is maybe why the story is in the Bible and why we retell it, why we reread it, why we oftentimes preach on it. What is more interesting, though, to me, is that the story could also be told in a way that's not dependent on moralizing, sort of, the moral finger, you must do this, you must do that. If you tell the story from the perspective of the slaves, you get a different picture. Think about the story in terms of the slave whose huge debt has been forgiven. The person now goes out into the street. Somebody approaches him, says, forgive me whatever little debt I have with you. You now have a choice because that huge debt has been forgiven, right? This is pretty unusual. Think about reparations, right? The fact that this huge debt has been forgiven, that doesn't happen every day. But when it happens, you now have some options. And this slave now has some options, right? Either you forgive or you don't forgive. Before, he probably even didn't have the option to forgive because he was in debt himself. Now he's not, and he can do whatever he pleases. Now, from one perspective, of course, demanding the repayment of the debt is the logical turn of events. But from another perspective, it may not be. So let me ask you, what might be enticing the slave to forgive the debt instead of to collect the debt? What might be some possible reasons other than the moral one, right? You ought to do this because it's the right thing to do. Might there be some positive reasons for the slave to consider forgiving the other slave, and what might those be? I see a hand there. Yes,
Yes,
please.
I see Alice, and then Anne McCann.
I think he might be rejoicing over the forgiveness of his own debt and pass that knowledge of how wonderful it feels to the other person.
Could be a positive thing, could be a celebration. Yes, thank you. That's great. Yeah. So it might actually feel good, right, to do that.
Yeah. I was thinking it would be an opportunity to form an alliance, to have an ally. And for what, I'm not sure, but it could be something that would be helpful, useful.
Thank you. Think about this from the perspective of working people, right? Slaves, servants, so on. You really get something out of it, right? Forgiveness, you get the joy out of it, but you get that alliance, exactly. Something happens when you forgive another person. You now have a relationship that you didn't have before. I see another hand that somebody, yeah.
Yes, I also see Carter and then Renata.
Yes. It would open him to the moment and free him from the burdens of this past conflict, and he can act freely and experience what's happening now.
Thank you.
And Renata, and then Chris. Oh, I'm sorry, Jim.
You might be muted. There's someone, I think, speaking who's muted.
Unmute.
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you.
Yes.
Okay. I thought that the slave who has been forgiven now has no debts. And if he thinks that he doesn't want to have debts anymore, then what he had lent, and if he doesn't get it back, then he will have debts again. So that from his point of view, he just doesn't want to start having debts again. And therefore he is asking the one to whom he has lent something to give it back to him. So do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
That from his point of view, he now has no debts and he doesn't want to start to have debts again. And therefore he is asking for the return of what he lent.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that is certainly one way to interpret self-interest here, right? To say, this would benefit me to stay out of debt if I had some additional money in my pocket. Yeah.
So the newly so that slave, as Renata said, could certainly use his newfound wealth and freedom to do other things for good people. In addition, a bit like perhaps the questions at Amazon currently with Jeff Bezos, where there's massive turnover within the Amazon organization. Perhaps reframing the whole structure, the whole business plan from the point of the slave owner might also have benefits for a better business model going forward, even in a profit system.
That's an interesting question about the business model, right? If you think about the perspective from the master, right? What is there a reason for the master himself to do this sort of thing? And of course, can you ever be sure, right? Because masters usually also have their own self-interest, and this may be a master who works against his own self-interest, but maybe it is also in his own self-interest, right? To have the slaves, be happy for a while or accommodate some of their concerns. But if you go back to it, I think part of that story that's course, there's a lot of complexity in Jesus's parables, right? Why would a master do that? And of course, what would happen if the master would start writing debt again, right? That's also possible, right? That you forgive, sort of do a reset, the Jubilee year, let's forgive everybody's debt, this reparations. But then we're going back into the system. And I think this is what Renate was thinking about, what happens, in a system where you keep incurring debt, how do you prevent that from happening? Now, let me get back to the story and the question of self-interest. If you look at this simply from the self-interest of that first slave, you could say, well, his self-interest is he wants to stay out of debt. He wants to maybe make a little money. He wants to buy a little house or something like that. And so having some money is in his self-interest. But on the other hand, as was also said, building relationships is also in his self-interest. Having an alliance with other slaves is also in his self-interest, especially if the master either changes his mind or you just go back into the debt system where people keep incurring debt. So what's more valuable? And I think part of the story that's to me so intriguing is it may well be possible that what is ultimately more valuable to the slave is to have the relationship, to have the allies, to have the community of slaves coming together, especially in situations where the system continues as usual and where the whole thing is based on the exploitation of people. Now, think about this in terms of reparations here, sort of a first step, right? Reparations could be, giving everybody some money, but in a debt system, chances are that even if you have a little money in your pocket, the system is built in such a way that the money will be very quickly returned to the owner and the master, and the slaves will be back where they started out, right? All fighting each other, throwing each other into prison, being suspicious of each other, being completely divided. On the other hand, if you had a system that would produce relationships, that would produce community power, maybe something would change. And that's where I'm headed really in our session today, as you address the inequality that we discussed last time. Everybody who's part of the system really has to think about what is my own role in here and what is my own self-interest. And too oftentimes, those perhaps who are not at the bottom of the system might think my interest is more like the interest of the master, who collects debt, who gets rich from, sort of collecting debt from other people, having debt written on at the company store and whatnot. My interest is not with the fellow servants, the fellow slaves. But here you turn this around and all of a sudden you can tell the story that we've beginning to tell, namely that there's an alliance forming, well, call it a union, right? That there is relationships being built that were not there before, or even if they were there before, they're now stronger and people know that they can rely on each other. Now, the way you tell the story is not you must do this, but you can now say, if you're smart, that's how you approach it. If you're debt free, this is what you can do next. The system might tell you you cannot get out of this, but the people's logic, the logic of the community tells you something else. So this notion of solidarity, I think that goes beyond the notion of advocacy. If the slave in our story would have seen himself as an advocate, against debt and something like that, he might have said, well, let me tell you how I did it. You can become like me, and I'm the role model. But if you think about solidarity, the slave now is part of the overall community and they're all affected. And the only way to get out of this is to realize we're in this together. We have to fight this together. And the only power that we have ultimately, in terms of the money that flows back and forth here, is if we combine our powers. Even if I have a little money in my pocket, that may be fine, that may make me feel better, but it's never going to be a match to the master's money in the master's pocket, right? It's never going to be enough to solve the problems of the system in which we find ourselves. So here, this question of solidarity to me is an intriguing one because it helps us understand sort of from the community. Last time we talked about this old language from Occupy Wall Street, the 99%. How would the 99% deal with this? And when we talk about the 99%, of course, we must not forget that within these 99%, some people are a lot worse off. But then the rest of us are also not in the place of the master. So that is what is at the beginning of building the relationships. And I think this is now the theological question too, because it's not just a good social advice, it's also the question about the kingdom of God. How does the kingdom of God function? And too quickly, we assume that God is always in this master image. So when Jesus in the parable tells of the master, we think, well, this is God. Well, for sure, this is a very unusual master. But maybe we think about God more in terms of the community and to say, well, once the master gives up being the master, at least for a while, some agency returns to the community. And maybe this is where we find God at work. And this is where we where we can now spin the story and to say, what is happening here. And then you have a full theology that sort of builds on this, your Christology. Where's Jesus in all of this? Jesus the master? Is Jesus the slave? I think that's pretty obvious, right? Jesus is not on the side of the master. Where's the Holy Spirit moving? Where's the community of the church? Take this back to Paul. If one member suffers, all suffer together with it. So the whole perspective shifts. Let me pause here for a second to see if there are any comments or questions. Last time I did a lot of presenting. I just want to make sure we have some time for your comments and questions here as well.
Joerg, just quickly, I think you alluded to it and got into it a bit, because in the way you presented the text, transposing it then and now, it wasn't clear who the slave was. It wasn't all clear in terms of how do we translate that now, right? Because it isn't obvious in a reading today who the slave is.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And there's sort of a bit of a gray zone, because if you think you have one master, right, and then you have a bunch of slaves, you might think of all these slaves are basically one group, and then you have a group of masters. But the more interesting story here is, in a typical household, you can take this back to Jesus's time. You can also take it back to the history of slavery in the United States. There were slaves in different positions, right? There were slaves that had more power, that had some leadership function, that ultimately might have thought of themselves as, well, we're the ones who are running this show. But in the end, they're not the master either. And so what I'm suggesting here is, what would happen if we, the 99%, think of ourselves in terms of not the master, but the community that is fighting an unequal system that ultimately is benefiting more from us than we're benefiting from it. So this is now bringing the community together. And I think it's bringing the church into the narrative at a moment when we don't usually think of ourselves as affected. Let me explain this by talking a bit about the difference between advocacy and solidarity. The advocate oftentimes assumes they can step into a problem, fixing it from the outside. The advocate, say, in a situation, let's take, the inequality that we were talking about last time, right? The advocate steps in and says, I want to help poor people. Not realizing that in the system, perhaps they too are affected by the way money flows. And so the middle class oftentimes feels itself to be the advocate. This is the role of university professors too, right? Seminary professors, pastors, and so on. We think we're the ones who are speaking out for those who are, the poorest of the poor. What if the perspective changes, though, and the advocate understands that what is happening to the poorest of the poor is very real, is very bad, has to be taken into account, but it's not that we're in control over it. What happens to the poor might actually show us how we are placed in the system also. And oftentimes we confuse privilege and power. The fact that, I personally do have white privilege, male privilege, straight privilege, the privilege of a named chair university professor at Vanderbilt, sometimes obscures from my view that I'm not running this show, that I'm not the 1% in the sense of, making all the difference. If the person who funds my chair is calling the Tennessee governor, he'll get a different ear than if I'm calling the Tennessee governor. In fact, you see this even in the way the universities are run today, where the administrators are making sometimes in the millions, and professors aren't, right? I oftentimes have to remind my colleagues at the university, tenured professors, that their salary is closer to the janitors, much closer really, than it is to the president of the university. And so solidarity here is something that reminds us of whose boat we are in, reminds us of the fact that maybe we're closer as the 99%, and that has some consequences. So the problem with advocacy then becomes that the advocate doesn't quite understand the system. The advocate assumes I can step up, I can say some strong words, I can solve this problem all by myself, and then it will be solved. Now, the system loves it, when university professors like myself speak out and make strong condemnations and claims, because for the most part, nothing really changes. I might get some publicity out of it, I might get some press out of it, I might sell another book, but in the end, the system actually doesn't change because there's some advocates speaking out. On the other hand, if I understood that solidarity was required, that I cannot fix this by myself, that I need to do this in connection with the community, realizing that if one member suffers, all suffer together with it. And what is happening to the least of these is also happening to me. Maybe something can change. First of all, what changes is my understanding. I now see more clearly what's really going on, because if I just look at myself, I don't see anything. I don't see what's happening in my world, unless I really see in what's happening to those who are challenged in my world. That's one. The second one, and this may be more important here, back to the question of reparations. How can we fix this? Who has the power ultimately to fix anything? And if advocates overestimate themselves, if we think we speak out, we solve the problem, then we're fooling ourselves and nothing changes. This is the other problem. Plus, thirdly, if the advocates then think we can act ourselves, we're stifling the agency that's also there in the communities. So if sort of this lead slave now we're saying, I have been forgiven, I am now the advocate who can figure this out for all of you, the rest of the slaves then would remain passive. Their agency didn't matter. Their power didn't matter. And of course, the lead slave would be fooling himself, because nobody can solve a problem as big as this inequality that we're talking about by themselves. Is this helpful? I mean, this is sort of going a little bit towards this explanation of how we're in this together and what we could do addressing the problems together. I see a hand. Yes, please.
So
Paul?
it occurs to me that if someone labels themselves an advocate, then they can portray themselves as a generous capitalist. Whereas if they label themselves as being with everybody else, then they get labeled socialist. And that's very inconvenient for them.
That sums it up really well. Thank you for that comment. I think that's the challenge, right? Being an advocate in some ways, especially for those of us, myself included, who have some privilege, is the more comfortable position, because we can portray ourselves as, we're in the system, we like the system, all we need is a little improvement. But that doesn't go far enough, because it ultimately perpetuates the system from which we may be benefiting. I mean, we are benefiting to some degree, but we're really confusing our own self-interest, or maybe it's even a mistaken self-interest with the self-interest of the majority, and the system will continue the way it goes. This is the point of Jesus, preaching good news to the poor. Well, it has to be something more than just handing out a warm meal, or, giving somebody a house. It has to go to the point not only where the poor are no longer poor, but where the poor are enabled to become where the poor are enabled to become agents in the system themselves. So agency of the people, in my view here, in my argument, is the only thing that will ultimately change the system. And this is the way I read the story of the unforgiving servant. If they all come together and the community of servants sees it, they see what's wrong with this individual who doesn't forgive, and maybe not for moral reasons, but for the reasons of the community, for the reasons of collective power that can be built here. And if you want to call that socialism, well, maybe you can also call it Christianity, right? This is one of the questions here that we have to ask, right? Is this just a political option? Is it an economic option? Or is this ultimately at the heart of the Christian message? And for me as a theologian, that's where the big challenge comes in. If we simply could, build a little bit more benevolence among people, that would be great. But what is the kingdom of God here? What has to be changed? So plug that back in with the question of reparations. I judge it that you probably have two Germans here in this group, right? I'm one, and Renate has a German background also, right? I know.
Yes.
Yeah, Linda raised her hand. So if you think about reparations, this is now this broader question, back to the question of solidarity. If you think about reparations, what you all know from history, right, is that Germany has done something after the war that in some ways was unprecedented, because Germany did pay reparations to Israel. And not just a few. I mean, this is a big thing. This is ongoing. Most recently, Germany supported victims of COVID in Israel. So this is an ongoing connection here that goes through reparations, which shows us that this is not just a pious idea. It's something that can actually be done. And somebody put in the chat that you have your own model. Could you talk a bit about that? What that model is? That role model?
Linda, do you want to say more?
Yeah, I think that we do have our own role model if we pay attention to the work that Jim Stewart has been doing over these years. He's head of our men's shelter that First Church has had for many years. And Jim not only provides a warm bed and meals and social support, but he goes to the sources, the State House, and he does advocate, but he also goes to where the problems have arisen. We need more funding for people who are out on the street. He works in solidarity with a whole variety of groups within the city and the Cambridge and Boston to promote this. So he tries to change the system. He isn't only doing good. And I think
Thank you. Yes.
We need to pay attention to that.
And a key thing about what you said is this funding. I want to come back to that in a minute. I saw Renate's hand also.
Yes, I want to say, I called always the charity work of the church band-aid theology that doesn't change the system. And I think that even with Germany paying reparations to Israel, I would not use this as a good example. The example that Germany did was when Mrs. Merkel accepted 1 million immigrants. That was showing solidarity with those who suffer most. So that there she thought about solidarity, but of course the system immediately threw back at her, and she was not praised. Maybe at the beginning, yes, but then not. So in order to challenge the system, we have to start this relationship, as you said. And the relationship with Israel is just one of guilt, so that we are not permitted to challenge Israel in saying, for example, we have done terrible things to you, but that's not a permission for you to do the same to others, even not to us, to Germany. So the problem is very complicated.
Thank you. This is really very helpful, and it sort of goes in the direction that I want to take this conversation, because assuming that maybe one can solve a problem as big as reparations by writing a check, however big it is, has its own problems, has its own limitations. That too goes back to the homeless population, the question of funding. If the solution were simply to give homeless persons a house, this is the way we oftentimes describe they don't have a house, they need a house, and they need some funding. That's certainly true. Not having something and being given it is important. But the question is, how do the persons that have been wronged or that are suffering become agents in their own right? And so for the homeless person, then of course the house is important, but having work is maybe what then helps to provide the funding, and not just any work or any job, but becoming agents in a world where, of course, you have to make some money, but also where you want to employ your creativity, your labor power to make a difference. That is the important thing here. And this is the conversation that oftentimes doesn't happen. As far as the bigger picture goes, the German situation here is indeed really complex, and simply handing over checks, while it is better than not handing over checks, has some of the problems that Renate already addressed, but let me be more specific. What happened through the support of German reparations to Israel was not only that money was given, but that the Israeli economy was built in a very powerful instrument, except that if you look at the Israeli economy and you compare it to the US economy, you can say those are the two economies in the developed world that are the most unequal ones within themselves. That doesn't even talk about the relationship of Israel and Palestine. That simply talks about the relationship within the own country. And so if the result of doing something then becomes that you create even greater inequality, maybe the ultimate inequality is not being addressed, you have to pause and to think about what might be better options. So my point here is not to make somebody look bad or some country look bad, but to say, could we have done something else, and what could that be? Based on the story here of the unforgiving servant, I'm really asking the question, what could happen if we were to build relationships, if we were building these alliances rather than advocating like the advocates who are oftentimes still acting from the top down. And in some ways, this is what the Germans did in Israel. And this is, of course, what creates the problems now, both of the inequality of Israel and within Germany itself, where you can no longer, even interfere or be an agent and a participant in other problems that are occurring. So my suggestion here is, and I'll put my screen up here one more time. Let me share that because I have a slide for that. Makes me go through all the other slides again, but here we go. Here was our Frederick Douglass quote. Here's a quote from Jessica Gordon Nembhard. This is her book, Collective Courage. I think I mentioned this last time, History of African American Thoughts. Apologize for the typo. History of African American Thought and Practice. In a piece that Jessica Gordon-Nimpart wrote for the Wendland Cook program that I'm directing at Vanderbilt, and you have the link on that website, she has this sentence. Early on, African Americans realized that without economic justice, without economic equality, independence, and stability, if not also economic prosperity, social and political rights were hollow or actually non-achievable. What Gordon-Nimpart is doing in the piece on the website and also in the book as a whole is she's telling the story of African Americans building these communities, building these relationships that we've been talking about, doing what these slaves in the Matthew parable could have been doing, but not only in an idealistic way, not only at the level of, religion or politics, but really all the way down at the level of the economy. And the story that she tells is the story of African-American cooperatives. What happened in that story is that for a long time, African-Americans have built power in the community in such a way that they were not simply challenging the political situation, but they were building economic power, which eventually would give them political power and religious power. That was so challenging in many cases. This is part of the story that she tells, that the white interests came back in and destroyed what the Black communities had built. But the story that she tells is there was flourishing communities. There was real power. There was real progress. There was real community. There was a real alternative. There was, you might say, the kingdom of God being built in such a way that it made a difference and that it challenged the system in its foundations. What Gordon-Nimpart is also doing is she's now today working on promoting cooperative development. This is the work that we're doing with the Southeast Center for Cooperative Development in Nashville that I briefly mentioned last time, that has a focus not only on building economic power of underprivileged communities, but building it in places of struggle, building it in minority communities, specifically African-American communities, in order not only to build community power, but to address the system where it is most distorted. So if you plug that back into the conversation of reparations, what if reparations were ultimately doing something that would enable these communities to build their own economic power, take control over their lives, provide their own funding together with the other funding that's also there, build their own resistance movements that are not just built on protesting and political petitions, but that are really built on community wealth and community flourishing. That's a different notion of reparations that Germany didn't pursue, could have pursued perhaps, but that we might be pursuing if you think about the future, where the point then could become addressing the relationships where they're most distorted. And that brings me back to the labor relationship, because this is ultimately where I think a lot of these inequalities are rooted. We had some of this argument last time. I put out some slides, and I'd be happy to talk about that too. We're getting to a place where we're running out of time. So let me stop here and see if there are any comments and feedback to what we've been saying so far. Yes, I see Hillary raising her hand.
And Alice, I see you next.
I was just going to say, I mean, there's so many questions raised here, it's almost impossible. But a small thing is, how can one avoid the pat myself on the back because I'm being so generous and helping all these poor folks and not feeling that way? I mean, yeah. Somebody mentioned with the two slaves. Well, one of the advantages of the first slave forgiving the second slave was that the first slave would say, hey, I'm a pretty nice guy here. I mean, it's only human, isn't it?
That is a really great question. Let me address that right away. There may be a few others, but this is really so important. This is where I think is one of the problems with advocacy, that the advocates who are doing some good, and I mean, maybe the theological piece here too, too often we think that charity is the most Christian response. I think it's easy to argue that advocacy and solidarity are actually more Christian than charity. The charitable person, of course, is the one most likely to pat themselves on the back. The advocate might do the same thing, saying, you know, here, this is all the good I've done for you out of the goodness of my own heart. The person in the relationship of solidarity is different because, first of all, you realize how the system affects us all, how the 99% actually is not benefiting from a system that is extractive of both people and the planet. But once you see that, you can see that within the system, some have some privilege. You know, some of us are doing better than others, of course. And then you can still say, now what do I do about it? Not in the mode of I'm going to help others, but in helping others, I'm going to address the system in such a way that I have to look at myself and my own complicity in the system. So solidarity here doesn't mean that I'm now the one who is off the hook because I'm in solidarity with everybody else and therefore fine. But solidarity is what forces me to re-examine my own privilege in the system. And I submit to you that this is the way that you're deconstructing it. So as white people talking about white supremacy specifically, if we realize that we're benefiting from white supremacy, maybe not as much as some people want us to believe, but we're still benefiting. And therefore we're activating the solidarity with the Black communities, the minority communities, and so on. We are thereby deconstructing our white privilege. And maybe this is a way that you could consider repenting for your white privilege also. Because once you put yourself on the other side, the system will let you know. I'll give you a personal example. I happen to be, as I said, a white male European American theologian. I have all the white male privilege that I want. But in my own work over the years, I have put myself on the side of not only the non-white, but also the non-male, non-straight communities too often, so that my white colleagues are now suspicious of me. I cannot go home again, in other words. I cannot go back and say, well, I'm such a nice white male theologian. I simply go back with my old colleagues, you know, from the Ivy League universities. I now have to change. I now am in a process where I am being changed by the community. So that's the process that I think is really at the core of building these cooperative relationships, that it doesn't allow you anymore to pat yourself on the back, and that it initiates a process of transformation where at the end, you're no longer the same. You can no longer go home again, but that may be a good thing. There was somebody else. Please go ahead.
I wanted to say that thanks to Carlene's creativity, we have a reparations fund which builds in agency for the victims of the slave past. And we're giving control of the dispensing of the funds to others. Hopefully, this is a step toward solidarity.
Thank you. I think it is. I mean, I would say that is the first step. But once you start building these relationships, I mean, that's the beauty of it. Once you get into that, once you take that first step, and once that agency really starts picking up, you'll realize that it changes your own agency also, because you're now in it together. And that's the beauty of the cooperative model, where ultimately you're not only enabling others to pick up their own agency, you're also realizing how your own agency changes in community. And that has huge implications for everything. It changes our ideas of leadership. It changes our ideas of, you know, who is really in charge, changes the flow of power and all of that. So this is, of course, we'd have to have many more classes to go through this. But that's the project that we put for ourselves here in the Wendland Cook program at Vanderbilt.
Yeah, I want to thank you, Alice, for underscoring the work thus far with the reparations fund. I do have a caution in that the process of enabling folks to step into power, and those, you know, in this particular context who've been historically harmed, is the relationship part, right? That power has to flow both ways. And what typically happens is that the already existing systems and structures and policies and ways of thinking, being, and doing things is really the place where white supremacy and racism is embedded. It's very difficult to relinquish power, exclusive power and control that is already in structures and systems, to expand the space so that others can have authentic relationship and share a pool of power, if that makes sense. So I think that's where the rubber meets the road, right? So our systems, as Joerg is saying, going to be reimagined. Ways of doing things, are they going to be reimagined? Because they may not work well for others that you're coming into relationship with. I think that's true for a consideration at First Church, but just I'm thinking more broadly and generally as well when we're talking about solidarity.
I would say that that's taking us a step further in a wonderful direction.
Yeah. And also Joerg and others, I noted in the chat, and I think, you know, textually we've shared and the quotation from Frederick Douglass in scripture, which in context were common parlance, but I wanted to note that in contemporary context, particularly being in the social movement work and in social movement sphere, that you know, I wouldn't want anybody here to be engaging in a group of African descended folks or Black folks and refer to us as slaves, right? Or our ancestors as slaved. It is becoming more and more in the consciousness, the general consciousness, that people of African descent were not slaves, because that suggests an ontological or natural way of being, which has been proposed and used by white supremacy. But it was what was done to African Americans, what was done to people of African descent, therefore they were enslaved. And then it puts the onus on the actions of others upon others, be they persons of European descent or African descent, and deal with both things in tandem, those who were enslaved and those who did and who enslaved. So I just wanted to point that out, Joerg, if you have anything to add.
I do, yes. This is extremely helpful. Yeah, thanks for putting it out there, Carlene. It also shows you the dilemma in which we find ourselves, where you now have to explain to people that an enslaved person has been enslaved. It's not their own fault. They were not born slaves, and so on. Ontologically speaking, right? This is, you know, I think the struggle that we're going through, because we have to remind ourselves of this, something that should be clear, but that isn't clear anymore. So the more we can make this clear, I think the better it is. But once you do it that way, let me also remind you, you now have another conversation that is not always easy to have, namely, who are the enslavers? And here, simply to assume that it's all white people, that doesn't quite work either, because specifically, of course, there were people that were mostly benefiting from slavery. Historically, was the plantation owners. Now, as Ta-Nehisi Coates points out, slavery was aspirational, so other people also want to have slaves. But not everybody did, and not everybody was sort of the driving force there. So as we talk about enslaved people, we have to take another look at who were the enslavers. And this is not to let anybody off the hook. The point here is not to say, you know, there were white people who didn't have slaves, but it is pointing us back to the theme of our series here, namely how the economy, capitalism, and whiteness go together. And unless you sort of put class and race together all the time, you're not going to be able to fight it. In fact, you're going to find that in the end, white supremacy gets perpetuated for a lot of people who are ultimately not benefiting as much as they think they are. That was Kianga Yamata Taylor's point last time. She said, you know, a lot of white working people may have more in common with Black working people, and that is what she called this material foundation for solidarity. So solidarity is not just a pious idea, it is also realizing that those who enslave people, and of course the same argument can be made for poverty, those who are impoverishing people have to be looked at more closely and have to be resisted. By the way, the language here of enslaved persons parallels directly where you could talk about poverty and poor persons. Except we now have to talk about impoverished persons, because the point is not that poor are necessarily at fault for their own poverty, which is what a lot of people believe, but that they have been impoverished by something or somebody or some system. So this is the connection here, and I think that may be a good place on which to close. The theological thing here, and this is why I'm a theologian ultimately and not a social critic, is the question, where do we find God at work? Not simply in terms of, you know, charitable work, not simply in terms of advocacy work, but could we imagine and reimagine the solidarity of God here? That changes our images of God, to be sure, changes the way we read the Bible, changes the way we are Christians. But I think this is what happens, and this is what happened in the early Christian communities, and where we're working on today in our own worlds.
Wow, that is a very thought-provoking place to end. Just as you were speaking, I was thinking about, and I dropped it in the chat, that just as a follow-up, my point raised was also to speak to what we see currently, you know, and what is, I think, more popular is reformist measures or reformist gradualism or gradual politics in terms of the systemic or reorientation of society versus an abolitionist, right? We're more and more, we're hearing about abolitionism or some combination of those, or a place beyond that, right? And I think our faith gives us so much room to imagine what our world could be as Christians beyond where we are. So Joerg, I cannot thank you enough for whetting our appetites, for stepping into this space and giving us a lot to think about and ponder. So thank you so much. And hopefully we will hear from you again. You know, as I mentioned, I know there's a broader community interest with other congregations and organizations that I work with, and certainly you know, First Church can decide how to move forward from here with where we are. So I look forward to continuing this work and learning more from you as well.
Thank you so much, Carlene, and also for these closing words. You've really hit the nail on its head when you talk about reformism versus abolitionism. I think this is the crucial question. And together with that, the question is, what do we have to abolish, right? What is the abolition geared to? And if we do not put race and class, capitalism and white supremacy together in these struggles for abolition, I'm afraid that we're basically coming back to where we were started. This is what the German reparations show, by the way, that you can actually pay reparations, but by not abolishing a huge part of the system that produces the inequality, you're not solving the issue. You're not really building that solidarity. This is maybe final word here about co-ops. I put that co-op center in one more time. This is why cooperatives are not reformist in the sense, let's have a nicer capitalism, but are really providing alternatives, to what is happening in a capitalist economy. So anyways, thanks for your time. I enjoyed the time together, and I really appreciated the input and the questions. This is a very enlightened group. I enjoyed this, and maybe we'll have more conversations in the future.
Thank you all. Thank you for your presence and all that you've offered as well to each participant. Joerg, blessings to you and your family, and hopefully we'll be in touch soon.
Thank you. All the best to everybody.
All the best. Have a great Sunday.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Go in peace.
Go in